The United States is known as a land of the free. The American character is rooted in independence, in thought, belief, and daily life. Yet the foundations of the American character are now under assault by groups that believe in changing not just the surface policies, but to also rewrite the history of this country, present new values to replace its traditions, and to reform even its foundation, the American Constitution. Under the narrative that some forms of speech and belief are dangerous,
Facebook's oversight board has decided to uphold the site's suspension of former President Donald Trump.
there's now a push to regulate speech and suppress belief. Under the narrative that America is too violent, there's a push to eliminate the rights of citizens to own firearms. And there are similar pushes being made to change the fabric of this country, down to a dismantling of its monuments and demonizing of its founding stories. Behind these narratives, however, are socialist movements and political groups that have misrepresented not just the history of this country, but even the very fabric of its system of government. The ideas that this country was founded on are now being warped and maligned to fit social agendas. America is more than just a nation. It represents an idea. And what would it mean for the world if that idea was lost? The American story was once seen as a message for the United States to promote. It was the idea that people, when given freedom, can create a prosperous and harmonious society. It was the shining city on the hill, with its message of freedom being an example for other nations to aspire towards.
And as we pray God, they always will, that another generation of Americans has protected and passed on lovingly this place called America, this shining city on a hill, this government of, by, and for the people.
The American story is now being attacked by groups and powers holding that freedom itself is a danger, and that government should more finely regulate the lives of each person to ensure social harmony. This conflict isn't new, however. It goes back to the time of America's founding, when the Age of Kings was coming to an end and people around the world were looking for what type of government could replace it, while finding the place of religion and tradition also in that new age. In 1776, the American Founding Fathers established one of these ideas, with a statement in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They established a government based on the idea that people's rights are given to them by God, and that government is only instituted among men to protect these rights. This led to the creation of one of the most prosperous nations in the history of the world, with its foundations in individual freedom.
They had such idealist ideas that when in the Declaration, when they said, all men are created equal, and that's the assumption in the Constitution. It's very hard to believe that people anywhere else believe that. Not so much on race, but on class, whether they're Calvinistic, then if you're wealthy, you were either more devout or you were blessed by God, or your family genetically they didn't know much about genes, but they knew a lot what they called bloodline. So wealthy people were just superior people. But this idea that you were going to have land and anybody could come anywhere and become an American, that was a very radical idea.
The beauty of the Declaration of Independence is God used these flawed men to put together these amazing principles that ultimately, not only did they launch the greatest nation in the history of the world, but it was the Declaration principles that Abraham Lincoln would stand upon for the Emancipation Proclamation. It was the Declaration of Independence principles written by Thomas Jefferson all those years ago that the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. would march in the streets and recite over and over and over again.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
So they put in place the formula, even though it took time, that ultimately then would produce the freest, most powerful, most benevolent nation in the history of the world. What they changed that other people had ignored in the laws of nature and nature's God was the fact that individuals were endowed by our Creator with these unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and others. They said among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But they began with this idea of truth, and they began with the idea that these freedoms come from God, not from government, and the whole reason we're gathering together to create a government is to protect the rights that God gave you.
After several years later, after the American Founding Fathers signed the U.S. Constitution in 1787, a very different system emerged in France, where the Jacobin leaders of the French Revolution established the idea, in 1793, that alongside the destruction of the Age of Kings, that God should also be abandoned. Under the new government, the Committee of Public Safety, they accumulated all power to a central government authority, established a state-run atheist cult of reason, and launched the Reign of Terror, to put to the guillotine all who opposed them. This idea of brutal suppression in the name of the greater good, of eliminating tradition and belief, and of holding a single centralized power of government that could control the lives of each individual, would lead to the ideas of communism and its system of socialism that would eventually sweep the world. And through history leading up until today, these two competing ideas of freedom and socialism have been at the heart of arguments on the role of government and the place of citizens. This has led to many attacks on the American character and attempts to demonize not just our history, but even the founding principles of this country. Yet who are the groups leading this charge against America?
So you have a situation where this Constitution has protected Americans' rights for 200 years. Their right to free speech, to assembly, their right to keep and bear arms, their protection from seizure of their assets, unlawful searches, unreasonable searches. It's given the American people more freedom than anybody has enjoyed in world history, and consequently more prosperity than anybody has enjoyed in American history. But it has stopped tyrants gaining power. And so the Constitution is the enemy of all tyrants. So every tyrant in America right now, from the radical left to the globalists, to big tech, to the Communist Party of China, are all trying to destroy the US Constitution. Because if they can do that, they have complete power over every aspect of our lives. That's their dream, and that's our nightmare. The left has tried to demonize America. It's tried to propagandize against this country, to create racial division here, to use the fifth column, the communists within this country, to create as many problems as they can. So America has to be destroyed. It has to be destroyed morally. It has to be destroyed through propaganda and even physically, because America is the example of what people could be, of what freedom can look like, of the prosperity, the creativity that is unleashed when you have a free society. The American people, in my experience, are the most benevolent people, the kindest people, and the most tolerant people that exist on the planet. But they're also a little bit naive and a little bit complacent, and they think it's all going to go on forever, and they do not understand that every evil dictator on the planet is working overtime to bring this country to its knees.
The New York Times has a new project marking 400 years since the first African slaves were brought here to the U.S. The 1619 Project, in an attempt to reframe America's history through the lens of slavery.
The New York Times Magazine is launching a series called the 1619 Project.
How is it that America is being attacked? Much of this narrative is coming from a rewriting and falsifying of American history. There's a push now to adopt the framework of the 1619 Project from the New York Times, which even its own fact-checker said contained false claims. There are radicals pushing to tear down statues of America's history, ban books that present history they don't like, and physically attack anyone who espouses the ideas of freedom that they hope to destroy. Many of these people are animated, however, by a false understanding of American history. And one of the main authors who spread this falsified history was communist sympathizer Howard Zinn, author of the 1980 book, People's History of the United States.
Howard Zinn's interpretation goes back to 1913 to Charles Beard, whose theory has been debunked several times over. And Charles Beard had a materialist interpretation of the Constitution. He basically said that it was set up by men of privilege to preserve their material privilege. Satisfied. And
the way that they frame the American Constitution and the American system is that, they frame America as this system of slavery, of oppression, rather than the opposite interpretation, which used to be the take on it, that America was a symbol of freedom for the world.
Well, it was, a beacon. I mean, there were very few places where people had rights guaranteed to them, and where there weren't titles of royalty, where people were allowed to think of themselves as sort of elevating themselves by their own efforts.
Among the many tricks that Howard Zinn used was to take information out of context in order to falsify its meaning. This included, for example, taking the Journal of Christopher Columbus, beginning a quote from one page, and using an ellipsis to continue the quote several pages later, completely altering its meaning. And contrary to the narrative spread these days that America's founding fathers launched their revolution only to preserve their rights to hold slaves, in reality, they fought a near impossible battle against the most powerful empire in the world, with many losing their fortunes and even their lives in the process. Contrary to the falsified stories now being presented, the reason the founding fathers launched the revolution is clearly explained in their notes, and clearly laid out in the Declaration of Independence. It states, "The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in a direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states." And it lays out 27 grievances committed against the colonial Americans. Among these were trial without jury, burning towns, abdicating local government, taxing without consent, and transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, among others. But the question remains, if the founding fathers believed in freedom, then why did they have slavery?
The Declaration, as approved by the Continental Congress, has a list of charges against King George III. And following the rules of rhetoric, you start with the least and you end with the worst, right? But then you get to his final charge, and his final charge is this. He says, King George III has created cruel war against human nature itself, enslaving men, and Jefferson puts men, right? So any question here about were blacks included under all men are created equal? Yes. Abraham Lincoln thought that the bloodiness of the Civil War was spiritual payback for the sin of slavery. So yes, absolutely, we understand the contradiction, as Lincoln put it, between the theory of equality and the practice of slavery at the time. But here's the point. The founders were aware of that contradiction. And they all envisioned, especially at the time of the founding, slavery gradually withering away. Thomas Jefferson, after we declared revolution and each state wrote its own constitution, Thomas Jefferson, a slaveholder, proposed that Virginia outlaw slavery in its constitution. So this caricature that you have these evil, rich white men who designed a constitution to keep the poor down and to keep minorities down and to keep women down. It's so easy to see the falsehood of that if you just spend a little time reading what they actually said and were trying to do. Frederick Douglass, to Abraham Lincoln, to Martin Luther King Jr., who all said that your Declaration and Constitution are wonderful, noble principles, and now just live up to them better. They would replace that with the rejection of the Declaration of Independence, the rejection of equality of opportunity, and governments intervening in order to ensure equal outcomes, which means an end to individual liberty.
It's certainly true that in the 18th century, everyone was a racist. We're talking something that's 225 years ago, and obviously if that existed today, we would condemn it. The point about the Constitution isn't that social reality of racism. It's, in fact, the reality that these founders, and not just the men who wrote it, but the families that raised them, their moms, their siblings, the unnamed people in history, ironically even some of their slaves or free people of color, were part of a society that did something very radical. First with the Declaration and then with the Constitution. And that was, say, two things. The first is that government's job is to defend our liberties. Its whole purpose, actually, is to make sure that we have our freedoms. And the second is that whatever government does comes from the consent of the governed. The Constitution was the vehicle by which we could enshrine the rights of those people who have been oppressed. So, in fact, those people who believe that America is an imperfect society ought to first accept that the Constitution is the vehicle that allows us to address some of the significant social concerns. What the Constitution got perfect, I would say that very rarely as a historian, was putting two seemingly competing goods, two competing aims in balance. On the one hand, liberty, and on the other hand, order. And what I've told students over the years is we don't want unfettered liberty because it's chaotic. We also don't want just complete order because there's not a lot of freedom. What the Constitution did was put into constitutional governance the ability of our governed and the government to keep those things in balance.
Challenges to the new ideas of freedom came early on in the American system. Among the first was the Alien and Sedition Acts, signed into law by President John Adams in 1798. These made it illegal to make alleged false statements critical of the federal government, and while they lasted only 3 years until 1801, Thomas Jefferson's criticism of those acts helped him win presidential election in 1800. The acts were later denounced as being unconstitutional, and they drifted from the concepts of free speech established in the United States, which even included the freedom of seditious speech against the government. Among the most read documents at the time of the Founding Fathers was an essay by John Milton that explained the concept of the marketplace of ideas. This concept deeply informed the views on a need for freedom of speech, including speech that could be seen as dangerous even to state power.
Yeah, it's interesting. Most people at home, they've heard about Citizens United. They know it makes Democrats very, very upset. But they don't actually know what the case is about. Citizens United concerned whether or not it was legal to make a movie criticizing a politician. Specifically, Citizens United is a small nonprofit organization based here in D.C. that made a movie that was critical of Hillary Clinton. And the Obama Justice Department took the position that it could punish Citizens United for daring to make a movie critical of a politician. The case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. At the oral argument, there was a moment that was truly chilling. Justice Sam Alito asked the Obama Justice Department, "Is it your position, under your theory of the case, that the federal government can ban books?" And the Obama Justice Department responded, "Yes. Yes, it is our position that if the books criticize a political candidate, a politician, the federal government can ban books." As far as I'm concerned, that is a terrifying view of the First Amendment. Citizens United was decided 5-4. By a narrow 5-4 majority, the Supreme Court concluded the First Amendment did not allow the federal government to punish you for making a movie critical of a politician. And likewise, that the federal government couldn't ban books. 4 justices dissented. 4 justices were willing to say the federal government can ban books and can ban movies and presumably could ban books as well.
One of the treatises that all of the founders were familiar with, because they were educated men, was John Milton's Areopagitica, which was an essay to the British government, to the British people, and to the world, really, argument for free speech, and the internet of their day, which was the printing press. And the Crown in England decided that what they were going to do was license printers with an oath not to print anything that was critical of the Crown or the acts of government. And Milton's point was, don't shut down the printing press, don't gag order the printers, don't require a loyalty oath from printers, because that way you will not have the diversity of opinion that's necessary for the good ideas to rise. Don't have a closed marketplace of ideas, have an open one. All the founders understood that. As a matter of fact, it was noted by at least one legal scholar that that was an essential treatise that the founders had in mind when they put the free speech clause into the First Amendment. Not only that, but the freedom of the press, freedom of the printing press, and the freedom of editorial control of newspapers of their day to have a wide variety of opinions, including but not limited to criticism of the government. And of course, they had just come from a revolution where they fought against a monarchy. They didn't want a monarchy approach to complete control over the organs of information. They wanted that to be a diversity of opinion and freedom in the hands of individual citizens.
The American